The first time I met Terry and the band was at Heathrow, the morning that we flew out to New York. And as I remember, the flight was delayed. It was an Air India flight.
What, to Europe?
No, this was to New York.
Oh, right. Oh, Air India, New York, yeah. Okay.
And you have a fantastic line in that because they were waiting around so long for the plane to take off, and Andy Partridge, never really having flown very much before, said that he had lounge lag.
That's right. I think we had a 4 or 5 hour delay, which was perfect because I remember Al Clark, who came with us because he liked to travel with XTC, of all the kind of new wave bands that Virgin had signed. I think he had a special affinity with XTC. He really liked them. So all the trips I did with them, Al came along as well, which wasn't unusual. But I knew Al didn't like being on the road. He wasn't a very sort of rock and roll type, was he, Al?
No, absolutely not. He was a lounge lizard as well.
But he used to come along with us. And I remember when they announced that the flight was going to be delayed for some considerable time, Al said he'd go and sort something out. And he came back with Air India luncheon vouchers so we can all go for a curry. And Andy went, "It's 8:30 in the fucking morning. We don't want curry." And Terry said, "No, what we want is beer." So we went straight to the bar. And over the next, 4 hours, I learned a lot about Swindon. I don't know if this will offend anybody, but the Penhill Mutants figured very largely in Andy's conversation and Terry's conversation. So I felt like I knew all about Swindon, before we even got on the plane. But it was a great way to meet the band because, we hadn't known each other before. It's always strange as a journalist and I'm sure for the band when you just parachuted in.
And Ian Reid, I remember coming up to me and telling me what I needed to do. You know who Ian Reid is, I guess. Apart from everything I needed to do on stage, everything I needed to do on stage, I was supposed to collect the band's stage clothes straight after the gig, get them laundered and returned for the next gig. And then Andy came up and said those things, and I said, "I've got a lot on here." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I've got all this to do and driving and loading and setting up." And I said, "I've got to do all your laundry." He went, "Oh, don't worry about that." He said, "We'll take care of that." So that was a load, a washing load off my back. Yeah. And
there was never time to wash.
No. Well, that was where the tour T-shirt came in, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Thank God for the tour T-shirt. Roughly, the XTC US Tour 1980, 50 shows in 65 days, 11,571 miles. We did have a couple of days off at the end of the tour in New York, which we thought was going to be, do a bit of shopping, have a little bit of a rest, and then they managed to squeeze 2 extra gigs in. Oh, three, sorry. 3 extra gigs in. And then, I don't know if you remember, at the end of that, well, that would have been up to March, but at the end of that year, we got the Vasco da Gama Touring Award from the NME for the biggest number of dates on the tour. And then, do you remember what Ian got you for a Christmas present?
I don't know, a tour somewhere else, I guess.
No, you got a ceramic. I think it was a VW Beetle or something that had a bulb inside it, like a table lamp that looked like it had been squashed when it had been made. You got one each. You don't remember?
No.
Obviously, that was a Christmas present that went in the bin, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so, Pete. Yeah, he
was generous.
Yeah, he wasn't.
From your point of view, it's the definition of embedded journalism, isn't it? You couldn't, just couldn't be more immersed in the whole process than that.
Oh no, I mean, there were, we were packed into that van, and you couldn't get out. We stopped in a few places, and
Does this hanky smell funny to you? That's what it was like.
Who's got my sock?
We were crammed in. I think they were right at the back. I remember there was me, Al, and Terry, and in front of us about 3 crates of Budweiser or whatever we'd been able to kind of liberate from local off license.
That was just for you.
Oh, yeah. I remember, did you remember driving up into the mountains, Cochise's stronghold?
Yeah, I do recall that. Yeah, and I also wearing a Davy Crockett hat at the
right.
Alamo
That's
as
the
well.
Alamo.
It looked like a squirrel on your head. It was just ridiculous. I'm wearing a leather jacket at the point. I don't know whether anybody's seen that photograph, but it's not a look. I can say that much. It's
You
a
decided
squirrel on your head. It looked like someone out of that Chevy Chase Christmas movie.
Did you give it all every time you played a gig, or did you respond
Absolutely,
to
it
the audiences?
doesn't matter how many people turn up. It's great when it's a packed house and everything, but our philosophy is the good people that have decided to come there still deserve a show. I mean, I recall playing a couple of shows with Blondie. Blondie had a number 1 or number 2 single in the charts at the time, and we played a couple of gigs with them. One was Blackpool for some God knows reason, and the other was Coventry, and I think they did the London show with somebody else or whatever, but we did those 2 shows, and the Blackpool one in particular, there was only 150 people turned up, and it was due to bad advertising and so on and so forth. So it's very disappointing, but we went on and said it's their hard-earned money, the 150 people that are there. It's not those that are there that are disappointed, it's those that are not there. And we used to just sort of play there, sort of like gather round. It was the Lyceum or something like that, I think, in Blackpool or the Locarno, one of those places. And they're quite cavernous places, so if you only get 150 people in there, I mean, Blondie were really pretty pissed off with it, to be quite honest. But from our point of view, it's 150 people that we hadn't played to before, and that's the way we treated it.
I did a lot of tours with the Pretenders, and the best single gig I ever saw them play was in Blackburn Town Hall, and I think there were about 25 people there, and they weren't going to go on stage at first. I mean, they hit a point where they thought, is it really worth us going on? And Chrissie just said, we're in a fucking rock and roll band, they're a fucking rock and roll audience, let's go on and play some fucking rock and roll. And they just went out there and they blasted it. They were brilliant that night.
Just going back to that Caracas thing, the police with the machetes, the crowd actually started a fire. It was in like a
That's
big
right.
top, wasn't it, or something?
It was in a
Like-
sports... it was in a sports arena, so it was big domed
Yeah.
building.
They set a fire pretty close to where all the cables went back to the sound desk. And so they came out with the machetes and started slapping people with the machetes to
That's right, they were
clean them
slapping
out,
them.
yeah.
I just remember them tearing into the building and all these big police vans.
Yeah, that was
And all
Jules
these guys-
Holland and Joan Jett were on that thing as well.
Jules Holland was on it.
Jules was there.
These millionaires.
And the Millionaires,
Yeah, that was a bit of an
I
experience.
think we were just the sideshow there. I think they were filming a movie there, to be honest, because could you imagine that sort of happening at a gig? I mean, we were just sort of like a bit of a sideshow. Actually, you were getting better paid than we were.
Well, yeah, probably were, yeah. Except for that we were talking about the Canadian leg of the tour, and I can't remember, it was Calgary and Edmonton and wherever, and Vancouver, and we ended up coming back. We played a gig that was sold out, and then we went off the island, I think, and then we had to come back for some reason, and the guy said, look, I could sell this out again, so he advertised it again, and I think you got most of the door on that thing.
Ian Reid got most of the door.
No, he didn't. He didn't.
He went to Reid.
No, he wouldn't. He didn't know about it. It was an extra show.
Well,
Is anybody from the Inland Revenue here?
Yeah, you'll have to frisk Paul Bailey about that.
Yeah, but that was the deal, I think.
If we didn't get it, it would have been the tour manager. It was
Yeah.
sort of like a stepping stone down.
Yeah, but we got.
Filmed down to the band.
I think that was the idea, was that you got a little bit more than you would have got otherwise. But we got a bottle of vodka, a bottle of Kahlua, and some.
Reid's idea was to keep Chambers pissed most of the time.
So you wouldn't know what was going on. Did it work?
Yeah, well, I didn't get any money, so yeah. Such a magnet for musicians. People sort of got there and formed those bands, and those bands would go to many of the other clubs, such as bands like The Clash, the Sex Pistols, the Damned, and all those sort of. They would go and see each other and all this type of thing there, and they would judge the reaction of certain types of songs, I guess, by the audience, and think, well, this seems to be popular, let's go with that. So they they collectively sort of copied each other to a certain extent. I think Allan would know more about it than me, because having lived in London and seen many gigs, I think we were different because we didn't get sort of like tangled up with all that type of thing, because we weren't actually from London. So I think the isolation of actually coming from Swindon was a little bit of an advantage for us, in as much that it made us a little bit different from the rest.
And you sort of couldn't take yourself too seriously, because...
Well, you know, when it got out that, well, they can't be Swindon, you know, I mean, hayseeds, you know, that type of thing there, bloody swine herders, whatever. I mean, Swine Town, I mean, that's what the place was called originally. I mean, Pig Hill, you know. So from a rock and roll musical aspect, I mean, Swindon's sort of like the Akron of... I mean, Devo came from Akron. I mean, you wouldn't get anything more different than that at the time. But because they didn't come from Los Angeles and New York. So I think to a certain degree, there's a freshness about it. Whether you like it or not depends on your own personal choice. But I think if you develop in a place like Manchester or Birmingham or London, any of the big cities, and you've got the opportunity to go and see these things, there's a diversity there for sure. But I think you know, a fashion trend will sort of tend to get things all very similar, and it's a similar sort of path that these people take, unless of course you're extraordinarily artistic, like the likes of Partridge. I mean, he's very individualistic, and he's drawn his influences from people there. I mean, he'd be the one to have to tell everybody where they came from, and God knows where they do come from. But that makes a band a little bit different from the others, I think. You know, I mean, there's strengths for bands like The Clash. Joe Strummer was an extraordinary individual. You know, each band sort of has to have some leader, I guess, and Partridge was certainly ours.
Good. I remember sitting around one night, and I think Andy and Dave, mostly, probably you and Colin, doing backing vocals, and you don't do them, do you? No. But just sitting around, and they started trotting out a few Beatles songs and singing along. It was like a bit of a nice little pub atmosphere, you know, with about half a dozen of us in there. Yeah, it was always good fun. And I mean, Andy, like Terry said, he was so funny. He was just, some of the things he came out with. We got a Christmas card off him one year when we opened it, and I think we were in bed when we opened it, and he'd torn up a load of little bits of tissue paper and stuff. So when you opened it, it was just like covered in tissue paper.
It's fashionable now.
Yeah, he's well ahead of the curve there. And he did some great drawings of Steve, which... yeah, I think that's
they were
their best
naked
kept
drawings,
out
I
of
assume.
yeah. Yeah, but I mean, he made you sick, really, because he was so talented. He could turn his hand to anything, you know. He's like drawing, writing, he's funny. He was obviously a talented songwriter, musician, and couldn't drive. But there you go, see? Everybody's flawed.
You see, it was an extraordinary experience. I don't know whether anybody's been lucky enough to go to Japan, but it's a different world over there. And having gone from Australia, which is also a different world, where drinking is a heavy part of people's lives out there. Mr. Jones had backed me up on that one, and it's pretty much a Wild West sort of environment out there, or it was back then. And to have the cultural shock of actually going to Japan after that, where everybody bows and they're very polite and everything. It was just, and we went from Australian wintertime, which is not that bad, but into extreme heat in Japan in August, and it was just, well, Stephen will tell you, it was just, I don't know, you could have been on a different planet, and your body's not ready for that dramatic change. And just culturally, it's such a different place, and I just felt like a complete heathen there, to be honest. Yeah, it was quite a dramatic experience.
Does that explain this? About that tour in '82 that got canceled. Before that, when you were getting ready for that, or those 2 weeks that did happen, could you sense, was there anything going on? I mean, was it even at the start, was it like, did it feel different than getting ready for another tour? Because, you know, Andy told us about the changes he went through. Were you aware to where that maybe affected anything in the whole process up to that, where the cancellation finally happened?
From my point of view, I was unaware of that. I know Andy, he was suffering from a bit of fatigue, I think, when we were in the European thing. I think in Paris there was signs that, you know, he probably needed a rest. But we were sort of committed to this American thing there, because these things, in order to do these things, they have to be put in place well in advance. So, and you can't sort of predict illness or anything like that coming along the way. I've always sort of thought that we had very unsympathetic management that sort of basically flogged Partridge in particular like a racehorse, you know, and he was just fit for the knacker's yard at the end of it, because the guy just needed a rest, really. But we had unsympathetic management. It was one of those things that strike while the iron's hot. You never know, this could all collapse. The next album could be a complete disaster, and it was a question of sort of, you know, just keeping it rolling for as long as it could go, because we didn't have, and no band can have any idea of how long these things are going to last. So I think it's synonymous with not only XTC, most bands. I think Allan would probably know more bands than I do, but seems to me that good bands and bands that sustain a long career have good management, which, you know, by that I mean they manage to manage people rather than sort of making perhaps good business decisions, but also realise that you know, the guys in the band are human as well. And I mean, we've only got to look at the unfortunate incident with Taylor Hawkins in recent times, of a guy that's only 50 years of age. I mean, John Bonham springs to mind as well, only 32 when he died, of the workload that's involved with this type of thing. Now, Taylor Hawkins was only 50. I say only 50, but when you're playing the sort of music that the Foo Fighters do, which is pretty frenetic stuff, which is great, and we also did similar stuff to that, I guess, in a sense. When you're 20, 21, Alan Jones would be able to tell you that. All the early stuff that we were doing, it was all 100 miles an hour. Now, I don't play any of that stuff now, because I'm 67, and it's impossible to do that. Yeah, I can do most of the stuff we do now. We do two 1 hour sets with a 15-minute break in between it, but it's paced, so that at my age, I'm still capable of doing well, arguably, that's for you to decide, but a reasonable job of what you do. But you couldn't play stuff like Science Friction, for example, if anybody's aware of that song, and Neon Shuffle, and some of the other frenetic stuff from the early days. Now, going back to the Taylor Hawkins situation, he's in a band where, you know, he has to play those songs, you know, because they are the big Foo Fighters hits. And to be able to do those things at that pace, that energy, and one thing or another at 50, you know, it seems to me that you need some enhancement. And I think, you know, it's unfortunate that I think that's the way things go there. And that's my opinion. If that answers the question, I'm not sure.
Just to pick up on a point that Terry said about management, I mean, that is really crucial. I mean, all the groups that I used to hang out with in those days, the majority of them had really good managers, like, you know, Elvis Costello and Nick Lowe had, Jake Riviera in the Feel Good Sadie Geico.
I've got one of the best
managers. Yeah, Paul McGuinness.
And they sustain as a band.
Yeah, so it is crucial, and it's often that, say with Jake and Elvis and Nick Lowe, that Jake and Nick had known each other for years, so they were friends. They became friends with Costello. I only met Ian. Is it Ian Reid? A couple of times. And the first time I met him, I couldn't believe that he was the group's manager. He had this kind of blazer on with little, gold buttons with anchors on them or something.
A briefcase.
Yeah, I mean, later, it was like Ian Faith from Spinal Tap, And I thought, this guy is not really working for the group. I think, did he go to Venezuela? I seem to remember him.
I don't remember him being there.
Hotel there, and just listening.
Sure, he
I
was
thought,
there
this
when they
guy
came back with the money.
knows nothing at all, absolutely nothing at all. And then later, reading about, the contracts he'd had the band sign, and his relations with Virgin. I mean, just supported all my worst suspicions about how unqualified he was to be the manager of anything, let alone a fucking group.
Just speaking of that, sorry about that. Just speaking about the contract that was signed, I suppose I should share the story with you that when we actually signed our deal with Virgin Records, we were in a guy called Stephen Fisher's office, which he was a solicitor that worked for people like Malcolm McLaren, and he dealt with the Sex Pistols amongst many others, and did their deals which ripped off a lot of record companies and one thing and another. So he was the head, I guess, musical solicitor in London, and he was representing Ian Reid in conjunction with Virgin Records, and we, the four members of XTC, Partridge, Moulding and Barry Andrews and myself, we had a local guy from Swindon who was a real estate solicitor. I mean, it was sort of like a David and Goliath sort of situation. When you go there, he was completely out of his depth there, bloke, and he didn't know one end of the contract from the other. Anyway, during the process of signing these things, Dennis Detheridge, that was Ian Reid's eyes and ears when it came to music, because Reid run a nightclub in Swindon. He knew nothing about music. He couldn't dance. He couldn't do anything. He didn't have a musical fibre in his body. I can't dance either, to be honest. But anyway, going back to Reid, when we were in this office, Dennis Detheridge, who he was a journalist up in the Birmingham region back in the 60s and one thing and another, a Brumbeat, I think it was called. Allan, you would be aware of that. And he was back in the time of Jeff Lynne, The Move, the Moody Blues, Black Sabbath, or before they were even Black Sabbath, and Bev Bevan and people like that. He knew all these people in the Birmingham thing. So, and Reid came originally from that. He had a club up there as well, and this is where he got connected with Detheridge. Anyway, without boring you too much, Reid had Detheridge there as his musical guru, I guess. So Detheridge is there with him in this office, and he took a turn while we were doing this, and it looked like some sort of heart attack or something. I mean, we didn't know what the hell was going on. Anyway, Detheridge, God rest his soul, ended up on the floor. And it sounds funny now. I mean, I dare say Dennis is dead now, I would imagine. Well, he survived this particular occasion anyway. But Detheridge is on the floor. And Stephen Fisher says, maybe we should put something under his head. So he grabs Reid's briefcase. That it was sort of like part of his body. It was like another appendage. This briefcase that he had. So Fisher takes this briefcase out, and somebody lifts Detheridge's head up and shoves this briefcase under Detheridge's head to try and make it more comfortable, while somebody phoned for an ambulance. And anyway, Reid's sort of there, and he sort of steps back over Detheridge and one thing and another, and then continues the negotiations with the solicitor. I mean, our Mr. George had no I mean, he just couldn't believe what was going on. And the rest of us, we thought, well, we thought Detheridge was going to die. And anyway, the conversation went on there, and wheeling and dealings were taking place there. Anyway, it came to a point there where Reid needed another piece of paper out of this briefcase. Detheridge is out there almost dead. I mean, and yeah, it sounds funny. I mean, we shouldn't laugh at this sort of thing, but what else are you going to do? I mean, nobody performed CPR. I mean, it wasn't actually shot. I mean, this is back in the day when nobody knew anything about CPR. You know, people just sort of like went down there and they died. And anyway, Reid wanted something out of this briefcase. There was something in there. And the fact that Detheridge was down there dying at the time there wasn't going to stop him from getting this stuff out. So he sort of lifts Detheridge's head up, pulls the briefcase out. Detheridge's head goes clunk on the floor. And I mean, you know, but that was either going to breathe life into him or something like that. And Reid took these documents out of the thing there and continued on with the thing. And the next thing we know, it was up a couple of stories or something, this building that we were in. And eventually the ambulance guys come in and they take Detheridge away. But Reid didn't show very much compassion for Detheridge, because I think Reid looked at him and thought he was a spent force. So, so I think it sort of achieved, basically, Detheridge's time was up for Reid, I think. You know, it was like, well, that's it. You've got me here now, and we're signing these documents, and okay, if you've died in the event, so be it.
Terry, when the band stopped touring, and obviously you wanted something new, did you look at any British bands, or was there any to play for anyone else locally, the sort of thing?
Yeah, when I sort of finished with XTC from the touring point of view, I think it's pretty well documented the reasons why that took place. Reid, of all people, going back to him again, rang me up within about 2 days of that and said that China Crisis were looking for a drummer, and that position was available. But I wasn't in the right frame of mind to be playing with another band in the UK, because I was on my way to Australia at that point.
Can I ask a question about EXTC?
You can?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, as a fan, it's really exciting to hear you play songs off albums that you weren't even a part of. Do those songs feel as part yours as the others, or how has that been as an experience?
Well, mainly, I mean, they're big shoes to fill, because all those guys that played on any of those records after I've moved on, I mean, XTC paid a lot of money for those guys. You know, I mean, Dave Maddox strikes me as, I think he got 10 grand up front just to do the thing there, and one thing and another. So, I mean, it cost them a lot of money. I was certainly working a lot cheaper than that. And but all those guys were fantastic drummers. I mean, I guess they, you know, they didn't want to sort of take a step back. They wanted to take a step forward. So, and they probably played those things. I don't know. I mean, were you there last night? Yeah. Well, I mean, I can only ask you what you think. I mean, I just did my interpretation of what I would do, roughly based on the original stuff there. But some of those guys, I mean, I can't play a shuffle to save my life, but because I'm not that type of drummer. I mean, I appreciate those that do. Maddox and guys like that, they're very good at that type of thing. I mean, it's not really my thing. I'm no sort of jazz player or anything like that. I'm more sort of like what I would describe as a meat and potatoes sort of chap. And I can only put my interpretation of what I would do on it. Hopefully it's reasonably representative of the original thing there without going too far away from it. But I like to try and give it a little bit of balls, for the want of a better expression.